They're the people you thought you knew and the people you want to know more about. The all-new Biography Channel. Step out of your life and into the lives of movie stars and moguls. From their most dramatic on-screen performances to the untold drama of their lives.
Every night, you could live another life.
Movies, biographies, and documentaries 24 hours a day. The Biography Channel. Call your cable operator or satellite provider.
It's the worst intelligence failure in the history of the United States.
The President did not receive information about the use of airplanes as missiles by suicide bombers.
Tonight, in a special investigation with the New York Times, the disturbing truth about the signs that were missed for nearly 10 years.
It took the death of 3,000 people to wake people up to the vulnerability of this country to these kinds of threats.
How was it possible for the world's most powerful nation to be left so vulnerable? Tomorrow, the official government inquiry into September 11th finally opens. It comes as a political storm rages around the FBI, the CIA, and the Bush administration. The persistent question, how much did they know, and when did they know it? Tonight, in a special investigation with the New York Times, Investigative Reports traces events going back years before President Bush was elected to reveal a series of clear signs of the terrorists' murderous intentions. No one can say September 11th could have been prevented. But what is increasingly clear is that U.S. intelligence and security agencies failed time and time again to share crucial information. And despite all the post-September promises and precautions, you'll hear how America remains frighteningly vulnerable to the next attack. No one but the terrorists knew exactly what would happen on September 11th. No one predicted the exact method of attack, a synchronized slaughter using commercial airliners as weapons of mass destruction. But astonishing and embarrassing revelations about the signs that were missed continue to emerge. In May 2002, the Bush administration belatedly admitted that they had known Al-Qaeda terrorists were planning to hijack U.S. airplanes well before the attack took place.
The information, as you now know, has been very generalized. There was nothing specific, as I've indicated, about anybody using airplanes as suicide bombs or using airplanes as missiles.
Also in May 2002, the FBI admitted they had been warned by one of their own agents that some Middle Eastern men enrolling at American flight schools might be terrorists. Those warnings were made 8 weeks before September 11th, yet they were never passed on to the government. So why did our intelligence agencies and successive administrations fail to adequately respond? The signs that Islamic extremists hated America and that Islamic terrorists were prepared to carry out suicide attacks and kill large numbers of Americans were clear for years before September 11th. The New York Times has reported that the missed warnings began almost 10 years ago and then built steadily in intensity over that decade.
There was a long drumbeat of warnings that should have awakened the American government to the real vulnerability of this country to terrorism.
The New York Times' Judith Miller has tracked the emergence of Islamic terror groups for 10 years. She has also tracked the failure of successive U.S. administrations to rise to the challenge posed by the terrorists.
Although the government seemed to understand intellectually Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda's breathtaking ambitions, they never really mobilized in a way to protect the country as if they believed it.
There were counterterrorism experts inside the intelligence agencies and inside the White House itself who tried repeatedly to raise the alarm about the murderous intentions of terrorists like Osama bin Laden. But the nation's leaders never reacted as if they really believed the country was as vulnerable as it proved to be. In President Clinton's first term, the director of the CIA was James Woolsey.
Well, it was a huge failure of security for the country as a whole, but it was not just a failure of the intelligence or law enforcement agencies that might have had a chance of picking up what was coming September 11th. It was the country as a whole being asleep at the switch.
Special Agent John O'Neill led the FBI's hunt for bin Laden between 1994 and 2001. He worked with Robert Blitzer.
The thing that I always heard from John over and over and over again is we don't have enough people out there, not only in the division, but nationwide. We needed to do more. We needed to collect more intelligence.
O'Neill told friends his warnings about what Islamic terrorists were planning to do were repeatedly ignored by the policymakers. Frustrated, he began speaking privately to journalists.
I met John O'Neill, and he and I had often talked about the threat we both feared to this country, not just overseas, but here at home. He had been motivated by his investigation of the 1993 bombing in New York. He knew that these people were planning something horrendous.
In February 1993, a group of Arabs living in New York drove a truck bomb into the basement garage of the World Trade Center. 6 people died. Hundreds were injured when the bomb exploded. John O'Neill later arrested the ringleader of the bombing.
We were all reeling after the World Trade Center bombing in '93. And he walked right into the middle of kind of the new counterterrorism world in many ways. And he had that on his plate, and it remained on his plate until the day he retired.
Well, the World Trade Center attack of 1993 should have put everyone on the alert, and particularly about ties, potential ties to foreign organizations and even foreign governments that might have been involved.
The 1993 bombing was the first clear evidence that Islamic terrorists were willing and able to kill Americans on American soil. But the relatively small scale of the attack and the fact that the bombers were caught meant it was quickly forgotten.
6 people died, hundreds were wounded, but somehow the message still came through. This is not part of a pattern of attacks to be directed against Americans at home. We didn't see it coming.
The director of the CIA decided that fighting terror at its roots was not a top priority for the new president.
The need to confront the underlying perpetrators of the attacks that were going to come against us from the Mideast was something that the Clinton administration really just did not have the stomach for.
Bill Clinton, the ultimate people person who could almost make anyone feel better just by putting his hand on their shoulder, did not go to the site of the World Trade Center after the bombing in 1993. That's really extraordinary in retrospect. He was just too busy with other things.
Investigative Reports asked President Clinton to be interviewed for this program, but he declined. A spokeswoman said terrorism had always been a top priority for the president. At the trial of the first World Trade Center bombers, the court was not told that before and after the attack, the ringleader had been given refuge by Osama bin Laden. That information was withheld by the U.S. National Security Agency. Wayne Madsen used to work for the National Security Agency. He says the NSA had intercepted phone calls, which proved bin Laden was in touch with the '93 bombers. But they decided not to share this information with the FBI or the court.
NSA, in a very typical fashion, denied the court access to the intelligence because they said to provide that intelligence would give away sensitive sources and methods. If we can't use the intelligence for something as important as a terrorist trial, what good is it anyway?
The government were simply not talking to one another. Different agencies were hoarding little tidbits of information that, if put together, would have much earlier provided a much more realistic picture of the threat that this country faced.
The former director of the CIA says he struggled and failed to convince President Clinton that the war on terror needed to be made a higher priority.
The United States was on a beach party in the 1990s, and it wasn't ready to listen, and the only person who really could have made it listen in a circumstance like that, it's not even a powerful senator, it's not any business leader, the only person who can make it listen is the president.
Deeply frustrated, Woolsey resigned as director of the CIA in January 1995.
I had 2 semi-private meetings with the president in 2 years, and after 2 years, I decided it would be better if there was someone in the job that the president wanted to meet with.
And while the director of the CIA was failing to catch the attention of his commander-in-chief, U.S. intelligence agencies were also failing to keep tabs on what bin Laden was planning. They relied on high-tech electronic surveillance, instead of trying to develop sources inside the ranks of the terrorists.
Where people are using the same communications they used in the 8th century, it's very difficult to use all these sophisticated equipment to pick up conversations that are usually one-on-one conversations using couriers, safe houses, and basically the communications used in every bazaar and souk around the Muslim world.
If U.S. intelligence was going to get high-quality information on the Islamic terror groups, they needed spies on the ground, Arabic speakers able to live amongst the terrorists. But the CIA was severely restricted from recruiting terrorist double agents in case they turned out to be violent criminals.
You know, if you're a young CIA case officer prowling the back alleys of Beirut trying to find out what's going on inside Hezbollah, and you can only recruit nice people as spies, you're not going to have much of an idea what's going on inside Hezbollah, because there's nobody inside Hezbollah except people who want to be terrorists.
At his trial, the leader of the 1993 bombers, Ramzi Yousef, told the court that Islamic terrorists would one day return to finish the job at the World Trade Center. It was a threat that failed to resonate at the highest levels of government.
To the extent that they were concerned about terrorism directed at Americans, it was Americans overseas, not at home.
In the Middle East in the 1990s, one figure began to emerge who was capable of uniting Islamic terror groups around the world into a potent and lethal force. But while the U.S. government was increasingly aware of bin Laden's desire to hit American targets, the political will to take the war to him wasn't there.
It's easy in retrospect to say, why didn't we see this coming? It was very tough for the people who clearly saw the threat and were terribly afraid for this country to gain the political support that they needed.
In the rush to economic revival and prosperity during the 1990s, the United States flung its borders wide open.
The scale of the challenge of trying to filter bad from good at America's borders is simply overwhelming. It's a bit like trying to catch minnows at the base of Niagara Falls.
Stephen Flynn was a commander in the U.S. Coast Guard. He also studied the nation's border defenses for the Council on Foreign Relations.
There were 500 million people that came across U.S. borders last year. 129 million cars, 11.5 million trucks, 2.2 million rail cars, and 6.5 million 40-foot maritime containers that rolled across American borders. And at the same time, there was all this transnational muck, including terrorism and crime. The view was that the threat isn't too real and life is good without these controls. So there really wasn't a sense of urgency to fix things.
Before September 11th, the terrorists knew they stood every chance of slipping past the security net at points of entry and then disappearing into the heart of America. Islamic terrorists have repeatedly been able to enter the U.S. legally using student visas. When their visas expired, the terrorists simply melted into the surrounding population. One of the 1993 bombers, Ayad Ishmael, was able to continue living in New York for 3 years after his student visa had expired.
The importance was not given by the Congress or by the executive branch to seeing to it that visas were looked into thoroughly, done properly, followed up on. People were notified promptly if their visa had expired.
But while the visa loophole was left unplugged, airport security was reviewed. In 1996, President Clinton asked Vice President Al Gore to head a commission to investigate aviation security. The Gore Commission quickly identified another loophole: the failure by the FBI and CIA to share information about terrorist suspects with airline security. The commission therefore made an urgent recommendation. Give properly cleared airline and airport security personnel access to the classified information they need to know. The commission's chief of staff was Jerry Kavar.
The Commission made about 37 total recommendations on aviation security, and most of them have not been implemented fully, and some of them not at all.
4 years later, in 2001, the FBI and CIA failed to alert U.S. airlines that 2 terrorists had entered the country. The 2 were then able to board and hijack the plane that was smashed into the Pentagon on September 11th.
Had the Gore Commission recommendation that information on terrorists or potential terrorists from law enforcement intelligence agencies been provided to the airlines, that hijacking may have been averted.
But before September 11th, the Gore Commission's recommendations for tightening security at America's airports were simply ignored.
I think the response from policymakers at the highest level to almost all Commission reports is to put them on the shelves in the absence of another compelling event that attracts public attention.
Between 1995 and 1998, FBI Special Agent John O'Neill appeared 3 times before Congress and spoke privately to journalists about the danger of attacks by Islamic terrorists on U.S. soil.
And he tried desperately to waken his own government. He went public, he gave interviews, he met with some of us and talked on a background basis, and he gave astonishing testimony on the Hill, which basically said, we are in danger, this country is a target, they, the militants, want to do us ill here at home. And nobody listened, and no one was more frustrated than John O'Neill.
By 1998, Washington and the country's attention had been diverted by other matters closer to home.
We were beginning to see the concentration on Monica Lewinsky, the obsessive preoccupation with the entire country, including reporters, by the way, on whether or not the president had had an affair with his intern.
By the time the country and the administration regained focus, Osama bin Laden had crossed international boundaries to weld together a new terrorist alliance the world would come to know as the base, or Al-Qaeda.
Al-Qaeda had become what one source called Starbucks. It was international. Osama bin Laden had managed to overcome the religious quarrels and the ethnic divide. It was the kind of terrorist militant organization that the world had never seen before.
And while the terrorists grew in their strength and determination to bring the war to America, America's defenses remained fatally flawed. In the second half of the 90s, American targets overseas were the subject of repeated lethal terrorist attacks. The Clinton administration seemed to finally wake up to the danger. Direct action against bin Laden, including attempts to kill him, were sanctioned. But each time there was a stumble, a crucial misstep, and by now the terrorists had gone global, and the efforts to contain them were doomed to fail. In the late 1990s, America was enjoying a period of unprecedented prosperity. The Cold War had been won, and the future seemed secure. But Islamic terror groups were intent on killing Americans wherever they could. In June 1996, Al-Qaeda suicide terrorists drove a truck bomb into an American barracks in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia. The explosion killed 19 servicemen.
We will not rest in our efforts to find who is responsible for this outrage, to pursue them and to punish them.
To protect and defend America in his second term, President Clinton appointed a new national security advisor, Samuel R. Berger.
There was a substantial amount of heightened activity with the president on bioterrorism and other issues being very, very clear that this was a challenge of our generation.
In August 1998, America's embassies in 2 African cities were devastated, again by Al-Qaeda suicide bombs. More than 250 people died.
Anyone who attacks one American attacks every American, and we protect and defend our own.
The embassy bombings were a wake-up call for the second Clinton administration. The U.S. hit back with cruise missiles.
For the first time, we really had a clear evidence of Al-Qaeda, bin Laden responsibility. And then soon thereafter, we learned that bin Laden would be at a particular camp in Afghanistan with a number of his operatives. We attacked that camp very severely in an effort to destroy bin Laden and his operatives.
This strategy of long-range strikes using cruise missiles against bin Laden and Al-Qaeda proved ineffective.
Although the Clinton administration was willing to stand off and shoot cruise missiles at things from time to time, a consistent approach toward exerting American power on the things that mattered in the Mideast, the will, I think, just wasn't there.
Sources inside the Clinton administration told reporters there was a lack of imagination from the Pentagon.
I remember the men and women around Clinton complaining repeatedly about the unwillingness of the Pentagon to provide what they called modest solutions.
The White House wanted to send small commando teams to hunt down bin Laden, but Pentagon planners thought it was too great a risk to the lives of U.S. soldiers. They would only support large numbers of troops on the ground, something the Clinton White House believed was unacceptable to the American public.
You have to remember that in the entire Clinton administration, there were about 60 Americans who were killed by foreign terrorist acts, as opposed to over 450 people who were killed by foreign terrorist acts in the Reagan administration. So yes, this was a mounting problem, but I don't think that anyone suggested that we could launch a full-scale war on Afghanistan.
This list of those killed doesn't include the 200-plus employees and others murdered at the American embassies in Africa, killings directly traced to Al-Qaeda. Aware of the link, President Clinton kept trying. The New York Times has reported that 3 times between 1998 and 2000, he authorized the CIA to assassinate Osama bin Laden.
Each time, the director of Central Intelligence, George Tenet, called up after the order had been given and said, "Mr. President, I just don't think that the intelligence is good enough, is reliable enough. We should call off the raid."
Each time, President Clinton accepted George Tenet's advice and called off the assassination attempt.
We got ready to go because the president had authorized an attack at any point where we had substantial confidence of success. But to attack and to not get bin Laden would, I think, have been counterproductive, because it simply would have elevated bin Laden and shown the United States to be unable to destroy him.
But while the Clinton administration tried to keep bin Laden at arm's length, there were further ominous signs that Al-Qaeda terrorists were determined to bring the war onto American shores. Al-Qaeda terrorist Ahmed Razam was arrested in December 1999, crossing the Canadian border into Washington state. In the trunk of his car, police found 130 pounds of bomb-making materials. The Al-Qaeda plan was to blow up Los Angeles airport on the eve of the millennium.
Now, how and why the administration did not figure out that America, too, was vulnerable after that kind of assault is something that will continue to confound all of us.
In June 2000, the National Commission on Terrorism made 37 recommendations and a major program of reform to defend the country against terrorist attack. It warned that terrorists' aim was to kill as many Americans as possible.
Substantial terrorism from overseas, quite possibly using weapons of mass destruction, is going to be the #1 security threat the United States has to deal with. There were a number of us who were saying it time and time and time again. All of the recommendations were ignored. They were all ignored by the Congress that had convened the commission. It was, I think, just a mood that, well, there are these problems overseas and they really are terrible and we have to do more to protect our embassies, but here we're safe.
And still the attacks kept on coming. On October 12, 2000, 17 American sailors died on board the USS Cole while at port in Yemen. The ship was rammed by Al-Qaeda suicide bombers. U.S. intelligence aggressively stepped up the hunt for Al-Qaeda and bin Laden. Their efforts were plagued by a simple but devastating disadvantage.
It was no secret that America does not have, to this day, enough Arabic-speaking agents. It lacked the resources that it needed, and not just the high-tech computers and sophisticated hardware that Congress constantly wants to appropriate, but the human resources to get the kinds of information that we needed. This was a big problem both for the FBI and for the CIA, the lack of human intelligence, information on the ground about what bin Laden was doing and when and with whom.
Please raise your right hand and repeat after me.
I, George Walker Bush, do solemnly swear.
In January 2001, the newly elected President George W. Bush was taking on the responsibilities of office.
Congratulations.
The Bush administration came into office in something of disarray because of the huge battle over the election and its outcome. They were late in getting started. They, too, were not focused on terrorism.
At the same time, the Al-Qaeda terrorists hiding in the heart of America were perfecting their skills for their final mission just 9 months away. The new National Security Advisor, Condoleezza Rice, was warned about bin Laden and Al-Qaeda's intentions by her predecessor.
I said to Dr. Rice during the transition that I believe this would be the single most important issue that the Bush administration dealt with.
I know that Condi Rice, who's very smart, heard what Sandy Berger told her, but Condi Rice came into government focused on Russia, the former Soviet Union. She was not a terrorism expert, nor were many of the people around her.
Investigative Reports asked Dr. Rice or a representative of the Bush administration to be interviewed for this program, but they declined. President Bush was also given a fresh and chilling warning about the likelihood of a terrorist attack on America. Americans will likely die on American soil, possibly in large numbers. The report, chaired by former Republican Senator Warren Redman and one-time presidential candidate Gary Hart, made 50 detailed recommendations for urgent action, including the establishment of a National Homeland Security Agency. But it did not lead to any immediate action.
Indifference is probably too strong, but the report, when it went to the White House and to Congress, and we sent copies to every member of Congress as well as the President, was taken seriously by a few people, primarily members of Congress. But I think those in policymaking positions in the administration more or less put it aside for the time being.
Ultimately, the Hart-Redman report met much the same fate as all the other presidential and congressional reports of previous years.
Well, it was very frustrating. There was a resistance to any fundamental reform or structural change in all the institutions, in the White House, in the Cabinet, in the Congress, in the Defense Department, in the CIA.
By the summer of 2001, the 19 Al-Qaeda hijackers, led by Muhammad Atta, were all but ready. They had learned to pilot commercial airliners and discovered that small knives and box cutters were not prohibited on board planes. On July 10, 2001, an FBI agent in Phoenix, Arizona, wrote to headquarters to warn that suspect Middle Eastern men, possibly linked to bin Laden, were in the U.S. attending flight schools. The agent's warnings were neither followed up by his superiors or passed on to the White House. That same month, President Bush was told of an Al-Qaeda plot to assassinate him.
And at that point, the president himself became involved and alarmed, and he met with Condi Rice, and he said, you know, these measures, these half measures at trying to deal with bin Laden are really like swatting at flies. Can't you bring this guy down?
The Bush administration finally began planning to go after bin Laden in Afghanistan. But on August 6, 2001, while on his ranch at Crawford, Texas, President Bush was warned by the CIA that terrorists controlled by bin Laden appeared to be planning to hijack American airliners. In May 2002, the Bush administration admitted for the first time that the August warning had been received.
Throughout the summer, the administration received heightened reporting on threats on U.S. interests and territories, most of it focused on threats abroad.
The Bush administration now says that the warning about hijackings was vague and generalized, and that's why nothing was announced publicly at the time.
The President did level with the American people. There was nothing specific, as I've indicated, about anybody using airplanes as suicide bombs or using airplanes as missiles.
But Investigative Reports and the New York Times has learned that the Bush administration and the Clinton White House before it could have read a detailed warning that suicide bombers belonging to Al-Qaeda's Martyrdom Battalion could crash land an aircraft into the Pentagon or the White House. This warning was contained in a report commissioned by the CIA and placed in the Library of Congress in September 1999, 2 years before the strikes on New York and Washington. And the stack of missed signs continued to build. On August 16, 2001, Zacarias Moussaoui was arrested in Minnesota. He had raised suspicions because he wanted to train on a 747 flight simulator, even though he had very little experience as a pilot. He was interrogated by an FBI agent who was so suspicious he suggested to headquarters that Moussaoui was the kind of guy who might fly something into the World Trade Center. But once again, the lead was not followed up. Moussaoui was only charged with being an Al-Qaeda terrorist 2 months after September 11th. At the beginning of September 2001, the Bush administration was putting the finishing touches to its plan to arm the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan, and so topple the Taliban.
I think the fate of that plan is one of the most bitter ironies of the entire tragedy of September 11th. It gave the CIA sweeping authorization to do whatever was necessary to get Mr. bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. That plan was on the president's desk on September 10th. It was never acted upon.
For most Americans, the events of September 11th hit like a bolt from the blue. They had no warnings, no idea that they might be attacked in such a devastating way. Even those who knew what the terrorists were capable of were shaken that day. Judith Miller was just minutes away from the World Trade Center when the attack began.
I looked up and I saw the first tower on fire. And I knew this was terrorism.
For veteran FBI investigators who had been chasing the terrorists since the first World Trade Center bombing in 1993, this was a nightmare come true.
Then I saw the second airliner come around. When it hit, my immediate thought was they finished the job. They finished the job they started in 93.
What happened that day also affected leading Americans like James Woolsey, who had been trying for years to warn of the coming danger.
My youngest son came up in the World Trade Center, not knowing that anything had happened. A New York policeman ran up behind him and said, "No, get out fast." So he sprinted through the door with a friend, and they were sprinting down the street when the building collapsed behind them. So he got out by between 30 seconds and a minute.
Amidst the shock and confusion, there were also countless acts of bravery.
And almost certainly the policeman who got him out died. So the Woolsey family is, to put it mildly, quite grateful to the NYPD and the firemen and the others who did what they did that day.
Not for a moment did anyone doubt that this was Al-Qaeda. It was the thing that everyone had feared all of these years, and yet, when it really happened, none of us could believe it.
One of those organizing the evacuation of the World Trade Center was former FBI man John O'Neill. After 7 years trying to alert the country to the terrorist threat, he had finally retired from the FBI.
Here was a guy who, for the last several years of his life, every single day, and I mean long days, was fighting against these adversaries.
On September 11th, O'Neill had been working as head of security at the World Trade Center for just 2 weeks.
I called his cell phone that day, that morning, and I was not able to reach him. The line at that point was busy, and so I called a friend of his, and he said to me, "It's okay, I've just talked to John. John has come out of the first building, and he's going into the second." And John O'Neill was one of the people who did not come out of that building.
No one can undo the terrible damage done on September 11th. The challenge for American citizens is to ensure that the hardest lessons are learned before the terrorists strike again.
I think we are no better prepared today for this attack. Now that's tragic. That is tragic.
For more than 9 months, firefighters and investigators painstakingly searched Ground Zero for the remains of those who died on September 11th. Yet the official inquiry into why America was left so vulnerable to attack has been repeatedly delayed and postponed. The co-chairman of the Joint Senate and House inquiry is Senator Bob Graham.
The issue of terrorism has been a concern, but frankly not a first-tier concern of any American administration up until September the 11th. Terrorism was thought as something which happened over there, not in the United States of America.
The inquiry was scheduled to begin hearing evidence in May 2002.
We are going to try to develop, on a very bipartisan basis, a factual account of what transpired before, on, and after September the 11th, and let the facts decide who deserves recognition and who deserves commendation and who deserves to be condemned.
Since recording this interview, Senator Graham has had to postpone the opening of the inquiry once more, amidst complaints of a lack of cooperation from the CIA and the Justice Department.
I've asked the question, why has it taken so long to ask the question, what went wrong? And not just by the administration, but there are other branches of government. I think the answer we're getting is not entirely persuasive, which is, well, we've had to focus our energies on fighting the war against terror. That's true. But I think a country like this is able to do both things at once.
Judith Miller, who reported for years on the threat posed by Islamic militants, believes the official inquiry must be rigorous, no matter what it uncovers.
There will be embarrassing revelations. The press has already begun to discuss some of them and disclose some of them. But is this country not strong enough to face the truth? I think it is. I think that if this country does not use this opportunity to ask those tough questions, then the 3,000 people who died really will have died in vain.
Of course, much has changed since September 11th. The United States has taken the war to the terrorists, toppled the Taliban, and chased bin Laden and Al-Qaeda into hiding.
Just stand right there, sir.
And since September 11th, security at airports has been massively overhauled. Increasingly sophisticated methods of screening bags and passengers are now widely used. The scanner can see through a passenger's clothes to look for concealed weapons. But government inspectors have also continued to uncover appalling lapses in airport security. Government agents were able to smuggle 70% of the knives, 30% of the guns, and 60% of the dummy explosives past inspection points in tests at 32 airports in the months after September 11th. Some senior politicians fear that without reform from the top down, the terrorists will continue to get through.
This is a mess. This is a mess. That's the problem. And it's not a question of are the people at the airports doing their job. It's a question, is the entirety of the United States government coordinated to prevent this from happening? And the answer is no.
Who can make that happen?
The President of the United States.
Do you think it will?
After the next attack, yes.
It will take another attack?
Yes. I think it's just the beginning of the age of terrorism. America will be attacked again, probably using biological or chemical agents, and Americans will continue to die.
To those few journalists who have tried to track the terrorist threat, the greatest enemy now facing America is complacency.
My great fear is that as time progresses, that their deaths, the death of the 3,000, will be forgotten. Other crises, other emergencies will come along. The attention of Washington will once again be diverted. And the next time, instead of 3,000, 30,000 or 300,000 Americans could die.
Those who worked inside the intelligence community to try and raise the alarm say there is a long, hard road ahead.
We have a lot to do, and it's going to take us years, perhaps ranging into decades, to do it. I'm sure this war is going to be longer than World War II was for us.
What it caused me to wonder is what there is in the American system that causes us to not take action until after the fact. Pearl Harbor or whatever. This is not a country that finds it easy to anticipate.
But if the horrors of September 11th are to be avoided in the future, the need for greater vigilance is clear.
September 11th was something I had always hoped I would never see, all the while fearing that I would. And I would hope that the leaders of this country now won't delude themselves into thinking that the threat has passed. It has not. Even if we destroy all of Al-Qaeda, the threat will not have passed.
The Commission of Inquiry, which is looking into what more could have been done to prevent the carnage of September 11th, will make its report later this year. It may lay blame at the door of agencies like the FBI and the CIA. It could even point a finger at key individuals. But will we learn the tragic lessons of the past? The next time the terrorists strike, they may try to use chemical, biological, or even nuclear weapons. The true test will be if America remains on guard and is prepared to make the hard decisions required to ensure that the horror of September 11th can never be repeated. I'm Bill Curtis. Thanks for watching Investigative Reports here on A&E.